Interviews with our U.S. representative. In this interview, we ask Connecticut Congressman Joe Courtney from the 2nd District about a number of issues. These are presented in a 7-part series, and the first one is Climate Change Action and the 116th Congress. I am here with Congressman Courtney, District 2 of Connecticut, and we're going to talk about climate change a little bit about some of the bills and resolutions that are coming into Congress, and your perspective with the Navy and the Coast Guard in your district.
Sure.
And anything else we can help you with.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yep. The landscape has radically changed, obviously, with last November's election and a new majority in the House. I mean, we now have a speaker who actually understands and is deeply committed to the issue of climate change. You know, obviously new chairs of the key committees, Energy and Commerce, Ways and Means, and Transportation and Infrastructure, which is really the three committees where I think the issue of climate change is really going to be centered. But as you mentioned, even Armed Services is a place where climate change matters. And I have a new report from the Department of Defense that talks about how they're viewing this issue in terms of just simple nuts and bolts issues like military installations.
A select committee on climate change has been established in the House.
So the Select Committee on Climate Change, which the Speaker created as part of the new Congress, the House rules were modified to create this entity, really is supposed to be the interface with those three committees so that the trains are all sort of running in the same directions.
Thoughts on H.R. 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of 2019. The goal of H.R. 763 is to create a carbon dividend trust fund for the American people in order to encourage market-driven innovation of clean energy technologies and market efficiencies, which will reduce harmful pollution and leave a healthier, more stable, and more prosperous nation for future generations. H.R. 763 is good for people. It improves our health and saves lives. H.R. 763 is good for the economy, creating 2.1 million new jobs over 10 years. H.R. 763 is revenue neutral. No required government funding. Fees are returned to all Americans. H.R. 763 is bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats support the bill. The majority of Americans support such action on climate change. H.R. 763 is effective, a 40% emissions reduction in 12 years, and a 90% reduction by 2050. H.R. 763 prices carbon at its source. The carbon fee is applied at the mine, the production well, or the port of first entry. H.R. 763 returns a carbon fee for everyone, a monthly carbon dividend from the U.S. Treasury Carbon Dividend Trust Fund for every U.S. citizen. So, Congressman, H.R. 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, after 10 years, Citizens Climate Lobby, all of our language is in there. We got it as a bill. We're very excited. So what's your take on this?
So 763, which I know you've worked hard and the Citizens Lobby has worked hard, is going to go into that mix. I mean, Ted Deutsch, who, again, is just another great member, and he got a Republican co-sponsor, which is no mean feat, shows that this is going to be a serious proposal that, the Select Committee will take up. And at the end of the day, a proposal like that is going to be at the Ways and Means Committee, because obviously it involves revenue and taxation. I think it's been given a new lease on life in terms of just now being part of a real process, not just sort of a message bill, which has been obviously the frustration for the last 8 years.
The goal of H.R. 763 is to create a carbon dividend trust fund for the American people in order to encourage market-driven innovation of clean energy technologies and market efficiencies, which will reduce harmful pollution and leave a healthier, more stable, and more prosperous nation for future generations. So is this a bill you can get behind?
I mean, there's no question we have to put a price on carbon emissions. We've talked about this many, many times,
Right.
and I voted for that back in 2009, which definitely was a battle cry. The pendulum swinging in a bad way in 2010. Looking at the bill, I think that there is still, a question in terms of, how much is going to be allocated to individual Americans versus investments in infrastructure. I think, frankly, 763 is a little light in terms of just, how, important infrastructure investments are going to be funded. And so I think that that is where I think the Select Committee and also the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, which is, serious as a heart attack in terms of moving an infrastructure bill forward this year, which is so long overdue. But as I said, the fundamental principle of 763, which is that we have to put a price on carbon, I think is going to be part of any package. It has to be. The fundamental premise of 763, which is to put a price on carbon, to create an incentive within the economy, moving towards more renewable production of power and just our way of life. Every economist of every stripe makes that argument.
Questions about regulations and carbon fees.
But I also think another sort of balancing act, which the Select Committee is going to be dealing with, is just where is regulation fit in terms of issues like methane emissions, clean power plant, fuel efficiency standards for transportation. And again, 763 is a little fuzzy in terms of whether there's some trade-off that they're trying to put out there in terms of reducing the regulatory approach. That's been sort of the commentary since the bill was filed. I personally believe that the regulatory approach, particularly in terms of fuel efficiency standards and methane emissions, I mean, it's like suspenders with a belt.
Right.
I want that additional layer of incentive, and we shouldn't give that up in the context of a carbon tax sort of trade-off, because I don't think you have to.
So one of the aspects of this bill
Yeah.
that Citizens Climate Lobby has really, we've stuck to this,
Right.
is it's simple. There's a fee on carbon, all the money except for operating funds, which is about 2 to 5% of
Yep.
what's collected. All of that is sent back to every citizen and legal resident. We can still have these other bills and other policies in place and regulations in place regarding emissions, CAFE standards, and so on and so forth. And we can do other bills for infrastructure as well. But we felt that a simple bill that's very direct and does not impact the budget or the deficit in any way is elegant. Is that a good move if you can make other bills, or do you think that this has to have things added to it like you started talking about?
As someone who co-sponsored the Green New Deal, one of the attractions of that resolution was that it really had sort of a very broad strategic view, which, by the way, incorporated the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And last November, it was reconfirmed and foot-stomped by experts from all over the world. And having sort of a vision that does incorporate more than just a sort of straight sort of back and forth in terms of revenue, personally, I feel will help build more support for climate change legislation. And that's why I think Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez deserves great credit for, as a new member, putting together something that was that powerful, to sort of advance the cause here. So,
How about combining efforts? A lot of bills are brought before Congress every month, more than 700 just in the first 2 months of 2019. Representative Courtney is a co-sponsor on some key bills, including, as he said, the Green New Deal. Across America, we find broad support for the Green New Deal. 81% of all registered voters support its concept. This support is across party lines. And for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, we also find broad support. The Yale Program on Climate Change Communications shows 68% of all Americans favor a carbon tax on fossil fuel companies. The same is true for Connecticut Congressional District 2 voters. 67% of the voters want this in Windham County. And 70% of all voters in New London County also support a carbon tax on fossil fuel companies. That's where the U.S. Navy base and the Coast Guard are located. The reason for this support is the current and projected threats from climate change of sea level rise and infrastructure impacts along the eastern seaboard, as shown in this map from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Economists support carbon pricing. William Nordhaus, Yale economist, said, "Carbon prices must be raised to transmit the social costs of greenhouse gas emissions to everyday decisions of billions of firms and people." So, pricing carbon must be addressed as an urgent action by Congress. H.R. 763 is an immediate answer to that urgency and can also be part of climate change, social and economic justice issues that are being raised in other proposals. How do you see something like 763, the Energy Innovation Carbon Dividend Act, being a part of the Green New Deal? Could that be wrapped into
Yeah, I mean, they're totally compatible. You know, the genius of the Green New Deal is that, again, it enlarges sort of the discussion to, you know, other communities and other parts of the country that, you know, are struggling with, you know, economic issues and healthcare access and, you know, job opportunities to really broaden support so that, you know, people recognize that when we talk about issues like climate change, that it really it affects people of all segments of society.
Trusting the process.
I want to let the process breathe a little bit. I mean, I really trust the process. You know, to the surgical, elegant approach like you described versus a comprehensive approach, you know, was, I think, a very smart sort of response by people that's there. And I'm optimistic that, you know, that the select committee as well as the other committees and cognizants are going to come up with the right balance here. As I said, that's really where I think we have to be. You know, if I had to put my pundit cap on and look down, you know, the legislative path 6 months or 9 months from now, I do think it's going to be something, it's going to have a little more size than 763.
Mm-hmm. More sustainable opportunities.
It also creates an opportunity for the country in terms of, you know, higher standards of living, more sustainable communities. Right. You know, that's to me still the battle ahead. The speaker is focused like a laser on this issue. There are some things that really animate and motivate her, and this is one. We did great things last November in terms of moving the needle. There's no question that climate change was a powerful issue for young voters, and we saw it here in Eastern Connecticut. The turnout at the University of Connecticut campus was staggering, and I've been around a few of these rodeos, so I can attest to this. The turnout was actually higher in a midterm election than President Obama's re-election in 2012. And it was really nasty weather, as some people may recall, and they did not leave. I mean, they stayed there. They did same-day registration. They voted, and there's just no question that climate change, you know, was sort of mini town halls talking to students. This was a huge driver in terms of that really historic level of turnout.
Delivering on climate issues.
You know, and delivering on issues like, you know, the Green New Deal or, you know, the Select Committee on Climate Change in terms of what we're going to actually vote and pass in the House is really important for us to do to show people that their vote mattered in terms of the process engaging and that your vote mattered, I think is so important, particularly for first-time voters.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So, with the subbase and the Navy and the Coast Guard here in your district, what are the effects of climate change legislation, either through 763 or the Green New Deal, or a combination?
Well, frankly, it affects all branches, and I say that with some certainty because in January, the Department of Defense came out with their effects of a changing climate to the department, and they actually list specifically the 27 military installations around the state that are affected by recurrent flooding. The storms just completely butchered bases in North Carolina and Florida. There are still military families in North Carolina that are living in temporary housing. On the West Coast, San Diego, Coronado, same thing. And so this report, which the House Armed Services Committee, on a bipartisan basis, actually requested, came back with, again, just the fact that this is happening right now, and then projecting out. In fact, it's going to be even more acute and serious, and it's going to require a whole another way of thinking about resiliency, the kind of thing that's in the Green New Deal.
Climate change is confirmed by scientific investigations, and its impacts are affecting U.S. foreign policy and the Defense Department. Impacts to bases, operations, and infrastructure are enumerated in the January 2019 Report on Effects of a Changing Climate to the Defense Department. 79 installations across America are impacted. Events such as recurrent flooding, drought, desertification, wildfires, and thawing of permafrost are specifically cataloged. The Defense Department also itemizes vulnerabilities arising from climate change. These include mission execution, operations planning, country instabilities, logistics, the Arctic, mission support, disaster relief, and humanitarian assistance. The Arctic region offers a stark example of the need for climate change action and policy. As more and more of the Arctic sea ice melts, more and more of the coastal areas and natural resources, including shipping lanes, are opened up to the various countries bordering the Arctic Ocean, in particular America, Canada, and Russia. Resources include mineral deposits and petroleum fields, the development of which further risk sensitive habitats across the Arctic. American security interests and foreign policy relationships in the Arctic region are tense. America now requires a comprehensive understanding of the changes occurring in the Arctic in order to develop proactive, productive, peaceful, and environmentally sound actions that bolster military resilience.
There's a strategic element in terms of what that means in terms of foreign policy in general. I mean, the increase in drought, that's happening around the world. I mean, there's just no question that is a huge destabilizing factor in terms of conflict overseas, and it's just a whole nother element of analysis that the Naval War College, the folks that really look out in terms of just where is going to be the sources of instability, and it's just a whole new element of military thought and planning that didn't exist. Really as recently even as like 10 years ago.
Do you feel that these issues are raising to the level of importance that you can get nonpartisan legislation through, not just bipartisan, but the broader scope of what's happening in America, so that we have these climate issues addressed specifically, not only for the Defense Department, but for all of Americans?
So, I mean, it should be. I mean, just in a rational world, the IPCC report should be something that people understand is really just not partisan. It's just really smart scientists from every stripe, right? Just weighing in on it, particularly in the area of infrastructure. A strong bipartisan appetite for the fact that, in terms of, every sector of infrastructure, from transportation to, home construction to school buildings, to, you name it, the laundry list and the to-do list does not really differ between red districts and blue districts. The president has repeatedly said he wants to do infrastructure, and so to me that's sort of the opportunity that exists there in terms of the most potential for bipartisan collaboration, because there really was a majority, even in the last Congress, to move a transportation infrastructure bill. Again, these are really experienced legislators who believe in climate change legislation, but also believe very strongly that we have to move forward on transportation and infrastructure, because again, that's the way you broaden sort of communities' support for issues like climate change, and infrastructure is to make people feel that they're empowered by it too. So
we've made progress because of people.
We got to this place because of the external pressure by groups like the Citizens Lobby, and to the extent that anyone can hear this, I just want to say thank you. Democracy is not a static process, it's a dynamic one. And so that's why what I would say is that as the Select Committee moves towards a very early reporting deadline, that was the whole sort of structure of the Select Committee, is that they were not going to sort of just divert and supplant the regular standing committees, which is real, where bills are actually really written. As the Select Committee finishes its work, and there's going to be a package that comes out of it. Obviously we want to read it and see if it works. But secondly, that that it just doesn't become another report that ends up gathering dust on the shelf, that we're going to take that and keep that momentum moving forward with the standing committees. And this is still going to be a battle. There are entrenched special interests, I don't have to tell you or anybody listening to this, that are going to fight this tooth and nail. We're going to be smart in terms of looking for opportunities for coalitions and collaboration and bipartisanship. But on the other hand, I don't think we should be deluded into thinking that this is, just going to be a kumbaya moment. We've got work to do here. Every member of Congress, should be brought into this, and the Citizens Lobby has that opportunity. The other thing I would just point out is we have 89 new members in the House of Representatives. It is a staggering number, but frankly, there is just an incredible richness to this group.
It's the most diverse Congress
and
ever.
And they are bringing world, experience, life experience to Congress, which I've been around now for going into my 7th term. This is a really special group of people.